Before we start, I want to tell you we have a very special person in the audience with us tonight. Robert Adams is here with us from Vancouver, brilliant mathematician, and one of the most remarkable caregivers I ever knew, and he and Anne's generosity allowed us to hear this story today. And Robert's son here is with us as well, who had a huge influence on Anne. She decided when he was ill to step in and stop working. And so that we're so grateful to have the two Adams with us tonight. So thank you.
Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. Good evening. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to try to speak through my tears because I was just so moved by that whole performance, and thank you for being here, to the Adams family. My name is Dr. Emily Silverman. I'm an internal medicine physician and on faculty here at UCSF. I'm also the creator and host of The Nocturnist, a medical storytelling program, and a former Hellman artist in residence at the UCSF Memory and Aging Center, which is how I met Jake, who's also a former Hellman artist in residence at the MAC. We have a wonderful panel here tonight to reflect on what we've just seen. And so briefly, I'll introduce the panel, and then we'll have everybody say a few words. First, here to my left, we have Jake Broder, who is the playwright of what you just saw. As I mentioned, former Hellman artist in residence at the MAC, Atlantic Fellow with the Global Brain Health Institute, and a decorated writer, producer, and actor for both stage and screen. We have here Lucy Davenport, the actor who portrayed Anne on stage this evening, also happens to be married to Jake. Lucy trained at Oxford in the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts and has worked also for stage and screen on both sides of the Atlantic. Here we have Dr. Bruce Miller, who was depicted in the play, professor of neurology at UCSF, director of the Memory and Aging Center, and founding director of GBHI at UCSF. Here we have Virginia Sturm, associate professor in neurology at UCSF, director of the UCSF Clinical Affective Neuroscience Laboratory, who researches the biological basis of emotions and behavior in neurodegenerative diseases and neurodevelopmental disorders. We have Susan Dickinson, the CEO of the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, AFTD. She has led AFTD for the past 15 years, and under her leadership, it has grown to become the leading nonprofit working at a global level to advance research, care, and awareness for FTD. And last but not least, we have Richard Tsai. Richard is a former physician at the Memory and Aging Center, senior medical director at Denali Therapeutics, and leads a team that is working on possible treatments for FTD caused by GRN mutations, and currently has phase 2 and 3 clinical trials recruiting patients worldwide. So welcome, panel. Thank you. So starting with you, Jake, this all started in your mind. What moved you to write this play?
This started when I heard an episode of Radiolab, and I got stuck in the car waiting until it was over because I couldn't stop and listening to it, and it was such a compelling story. The short answer is that when I learned that there is a disease that has a creative burst inside it, that blew me away. That fundamental fact I've been swimming in it ever since. That's really the origin of it.
And before we move on to Lucy, I just want to ask, when you originally wrote the play, there was a virtual version. So what was it like for you this evening to see it live on stage with an orchestra for the first time?
this whole thing, in a way, started with a hunch that was the orchestra playing Bolero and us being able to contemplate the painting, being aware of both of Ravel's and Anne's stories. And I was wondering what an audience would feel like if we could experience both of those things together. And that was sort of the quiet thought I had a few years ago, wondering what that would feel like. So it was nice. It took 5 years to see if to ask that question out loud. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'll have to ask you guys.
And Lucy, I saw you portray this role in the virtual version and was so impressed by how you were able to carry through Anne through a Zoom screen. And then to be able to see it live is just a whole other level. So I'm curious, what was it like for you to get into this role, to get inside of Anne, inside this disease, and portray this story?
I think my mic's still on. Yes.
Oh,
it is.
there you go.
So, I mean, I was extraordinarily lucky that I had incredible resources, even a little video of Anne answering some questions, and video of people who had this disease, and all kinds of scientific and concrete resources to know how it manifested and all these things. But there was two really important things, I think. I remember Bruce told me once that one of the things that struck him about a lot of his patients with this, but also particularly about Anne, and I hope I'm right in saying this, Robert, was the joy of her and the joy of her life. And that, to me, really unlocked something. And then when we were physicalizing the play, our director, James, said to me, and to all of us, in fact, these people don't know that they're living in a play about degeneration. They're living their lives. They have this tremendous drive to achieve the things that they want to achieve. And I think that really, those two things together really unlocked, with all the resources that the GBHI and having a husband who happens to be studying this come with, but also just taking that leap and remembering that these are not, they're not patients, they're not clients, they're not symptoms, they're real people living their lives. And I think once we unlocked that to me was the most tremendously important part of the process.
I'm going to skip you, Bruce, if you don't mind. We're going to come to you at the end. Virginia, you are a scientist of emotions. So I'm so curious, sitting in the audience today watching this performance, what stood out to you?
Well, first, I was really blown away by the performance, so thank you all so much. It was beautiful. And we work with people with frontotemporal dementia and primary progressive aphasia in our clinic and in our research, and we're trying to understand how the brain changes and gives rise to these changes in language and speech and behavior that we saw throughout this play. And I was really struck by early on in Anne's story, even before she had the language symptoms that were really noticeable, that there seemed to be some enhancements in some of her sensory experiences, including perhaps her emotions. She seemed to, maybe become a little more nervous at her art exhibit and perhaps more empathic to her son when he was ill. She also was sensitive to the smells. She was talking about the smells of her lab, and she had this gut feeling, it seemed to me, as a viewer, that she knew she needed to step away and retire. And, we all have gut feelings, and we can ignore them or listen to them. And I do think that the right hemisphere, the brain, is important in representing all of those nonverbal internal cues that we all have all the time. And we know that the left hemisphere of the brain is important for verbal information, including language and words. And so the left and the right hemispheres are kind of in competition in all of us. And some of what Dr. Miller and all of our colleagues have shown is that when the left hemisphere has a little bit of a problem, for instance, in the early stage of an aphasia, the right hemisphere can have this increase in activity. And so that seems to be perhaps what drove Anne to paint. The visual world and the patterns that she saw everywhere were really motivating her to paint, perhaps because of that enhanced activity at the back of her brain in the right hemisphere. And as the disease goes on and moves to the right from the left in the frontal lobes, that may decline and she might have become more withdrawn and less emotional. But in those early stages, there was really that enhancement that really struck me.
I can't help but ask a quick follow-up question, because one of the parts of this that I found so interesting was almost like synesthesia, this question of like, is yellow round or is it a square, or being able to, I think transmodal was the word that was used. I'm just curious, have you come across any of that in your research, connections between synesthesia and degeneration of the brain?
Yeah, I mean, we think of synesthesia as linking these, usually again, often nonverbal experiences, sensory experience of vision and sound, and linking them in new ways that most of us don't link. And so that kind of transmodal association would also be probably associated with a really overactive right hemisphere.
Virginia, I'm sorry, Susan, moving on to Susan. We corresponded a little bit over email before this event, and you said something that I think is so important to acknowledge, which is that for most people with this disease, they don't experience a burst of rewarding creativity, but rather it's a difficult journey of loss and grief. And I just thought that was so important to say here. Tell us a bit about your advocacy work and what you're doing to promote awareness around this disease.
So AFTD is, I think the important thing to understand is we are a community. This is a rare disease. Most people have never heard of it. I think it is important to know that most people don't have the comfort of productivity or newfound energy or creativity. But the other thing I'd say, Jake, that I think you caught so incredibly well is this is a disease of the brain, but it's not a disease that's just experienced by the person who has it. It's a disease that affects the whole family and everybody around that person, anybody who cares for them and loves them. And I think you captured a couple things very, very poignantly. One is the beginning, that the confusion, the disconnect. None of this makes sense. How is she changing? They're not connecting the way they always could before. So you can see it's affecting him as much as her. Another thing I think you captured so eloquently is the resilience that certainly Robert found in the play, but also I would argue Anne as well. They do find new ways of connecting. He cares for her so deeply, and he has to adjust that love because she won't. The way he's loved her in the past just doesn't work anymore. It's not what she needs. It's not what she can connect with or recognize. So one of the things we do try to do as a community is really practice person-centered care. When a person is slowly disappearing, how do you afford them the respect that they still deserve? How do you still afford them the humanity and the person that is still in there somewhere? And I think the final thing I'd say is I have worked with this community for actually more than 20 years in different capacities. And to a person, what there is passion to make a difference and to find meaning. At its worst, this journey can feel just like a relentless one of loss and where there is no comfort. But I do think that what our association and other places can do for people is create a community where physicians and researchers and people diagnosed and the people who love them can come together to work, fund the research, help each other, run support groups. There are many, many different ways that this community works together to make a difference and build a more hopeful future. And awareness is a huge part of that, and that's what this night's about for us. And we're incredibly grateful to Jake and everybody who helped to pull this together.
Richard, there's this heartbreaking scene in the play where Robert says, "Can we stop it?" And Bruce says, not yet, no. Has that changed? What kind of research is coming down the pike? Where are we with therapeutics?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, first of all, just what an incredibly moving performance. And Robert, thank you for sharing your story with us. Yeah, I was just thinking back, especially that scene you pointed out. 10 years ago, I started my training with Dr. Miller here, learning how to diagnose, care for, and manage patients with FTD. And when that question came up, what drugs do you have for me? What treatment do you have for us? Our conversation would stop. But it's really been just incredible advancement of science, really the last 5 to 10 years in brain plasticity, networks, molecular biology, genetics. And right now I'm counting off the top of my head, there's probably at least 6 or 7 or more drug development programs out there amongst the various pharmas and biotechs of drugs in development for FTD, various types of FTD. I never would have thought this 10 years ago. Dr. Miller, probably you as not. But so there is now light at the end of the tunnel. I can't tell you how long it'll take for us to get to that light, but at least there's light now. And I'm just incredibly excited about that.
Coming back to you, Bruce, I feel like you are the secret sauce that brought everyone in this room together. So 2 questions. First, what is it like to see yourself portrayed by an actor on stage? And second, I'd say more than almost anyone I've ever met, you really embody this synergy of art and science and how we can bring the two together to create more meaning and purpose in the world. And so just wondering if you could say a few words about that as well.
Great. So I'm very relieved that the guy that plays me is a lot better looking. So this is really fantastic to see that. And I have 2 systems in my brain that work really well. One is the sleep system, and the other is the memory system. And this play will go through my dreams and my brain for such a long time. I learned so much about it. It really, proves the point that if you ask an artist to look at the science that we struggle with, they give us a completely different picture. And I think one that is not only entertaining, but profoundly important as we think about how to do better in caring for people, how to be more sympathetic, how to understand the problems that a couple goes through, like Robert and Ann did. And so I think watching me portrayed in the wonderful way, watching Lucy's energy from the minute that the curtains came up, wow, that Robert, the entire play just moved me to tears. And then, just a comment or two about what an important historical time Robert and Ann came to see us. So it was a time when people were realizing that, and Bill Seeley at UCSF showed this, and Randy Buckner at Harvard, and Michael Gracious at Stanford, but they showed these different diseases hit a circuit in the brain. They start in a circuit, and the circuit's different for different diseases, and that's why we see very different symptoms. And I think now with Richard's work, we're beginning to believe that if we can understand the disease when it just begins in those circuits, in Ann's case, it would have been when she was creative before she actually had language trouble, that we might really begin to intervene, and we think these diseases will disappear like polio did in the 1950s. It's going to happen. And I think the thing that I do a lot of is I say yes. So Emily asked me why, how did this come apart? And it was because Jake, approached me, and he was smart, and I thought, my gosh, I'm going to learn something from this man. And I had no idea, but this is one of the many examples of when you say yes to somebody, you know, how magic rains down. So thank you.
Well, I just want to thank everybody here for the incredible work that you've done, artistic, scientific, and everything in between. And thank all of you here in the audience for coming. Tomorrow, you will get an email where you can send thoughts and feedback about this evening's event. If you would like to support future plans for UnRavelled, you can send an email to unraveled@gbhi.org, and Jake and the entire team would love to hear from you. So thanks again to everybody for just such a powerful evening.